What's up, guys, and welcome back to the Bass Fishing Tips YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about jig fishing, more specifically wintertime finesse jig fishing, and even more specifically these little bitty hyper finesse jigs. Now there's a lot of jigs out on the market, there's a lot of finesse jigs out on the market, but these little bitty guys are like the next step in finesse jig fishing. And there's a few companies out there making some really small compact jigs that I've absolutely fallen in love with over the past few years because they're super effective. They still get really big bites, and often cases I can fish them in the same areas that I would have to fish a Ned rig or something like that, but still be able to do it on casting gear and get some really big bites that you would normally only get on the jig. So in today's video, I want to talk about the jigs that I'm actually using and kind of break down what I call a hyper finesse jig, as well as talk about 3 actionable tips that you guys can take out right now to go catch some fish, as well as rod, reel, and line setup on this jig, because it's a little bit special and something that I've had to really kind of dial in to make sure that I can fish these jigs effectively, and I want to make sure and share it with you guys. So without further ado, let's get right into this video by talking about the jig itself. Now there's a couple different brands that I've been using, I've been having a ton of success with, and I really like. And we'll start with the one that I kind of started the technique with, and the one that really got me going down the rabbit hole of these really tiny jigs, and that's this little dude, this little Kitech football head jig. Now this thing is really small. I mean, right up next to my thumb, you guys can see the thing is not very big at all. It's got this little bitty light wire 1/0 hook in it, a very dainty little bitty weed guard, and just overall super small compact profile. But what's really cool about these jigs, and this goes for the other brand we'll talk about here in just a minute as well, is the fact that as small as they are, that is actually a 1/2 ounce jig. So I have the ability to fish this thing on the bottom in deep water, effectively in windy conditions as well, where normally when you're throwing what a lot of people call like finesse jigs, those like little bitty 1/4 ounces, those little bitty 1/8 ounce jigs, they're gonna fall super duper slow. They're not gonna get to the bottom, and then once they get there, you can't feel them as effectively as you can these heavier jigs. And so for me, this is one of those techniques that I pick up when I want that really small finesse, almost Ned rig compact size, but I still wanna have the effectiveness to fish it deep, to feel what it's doing, and get those kind of bigger than average bites that we get on a jig. The second jig that I've been using and absolutely loving is this little dude, and it's the Bass Union finesse jig. So it's very similar to that little Kitech jig in the fact that it's very small. It's got a little bit thicker weed guard, and it's actually got a little 2/0 hook in it. And so it's slightly bigger, just a little bit more bulked up. But what I really like about it is it has that living rubber skirt on it. And so that skirt is a little bit different material than this little bitty Kitech jig. So that's actually a silicone, that's living rubber. That silicone isn't gonna have as much action in the super cold water, or that living rubber will. And so when the water gets down like sub 40 degrees, like what we've been dealing with a lot this year, I'm going to usually tie on this Bass Union jig. This thing also does really well with spotted bass. I'm not sure why they like it so much, but all my lakes around me that have big spotted bass in them, which is becoming more and more of an issue around here because of the invasive Alabama bass, they love that little jig. And so there's really nothing we can do to stop them. We've got to learn how to fish for them. And so I've been fishing that little bitty Bass Union jig and getting a ton of bites. But that's really the 2 options that I use the absolute most. There's, a bunch of companies making these small finesse jigs, but really these 2 companies for me are the ones that I've found are making the smallest profile with the best hook in them, and still keeping it as compact as I like to keep them compact, just in those little bitty profiles. And even side by side, you guys can see that little Bass Union is just a little bit bigger than that Kitech jig. And like I said, living rubber is what I really like about that thing. So those are the 2 kind of jigs that I'm talking about. And when I really talk about that hyper finesse, that's what I mean. I mean, these things are super duper small, really small hooks, really small profiles. And even the trailer that I'm using on the back is a small trailer that I'm also cutting down. So I'm using a 3-inch trigger crawl the most with this jig. And this leads me into my first tip, is use the chigger crawl or some sort of kicking appendage crawl like this crawl when you're using these jigs. And we're gonna do that for the simple fact of you want the rate of fall on this jig to slow down just a little bit. Like I said, these are half-ounce jigs, half-ounce tungsten, half-ounce lead jigs, and so these things are going to go to the bottom, and they're going to go to the bottom really, really fast. And what I noticed actually using Mega Live, and you don't have to have the live technology to understand this or forward-facing sonar to catch fish with this jig at all, but what I noticed is that when I would throw this jig out there with a straight tail trailer, say like a chunk or something that doesn't have those kicking appendages like the chigger crawl does. And what I mean by that is, like when you put a chigger crawl in the water and you swim it, those little tails are just going to kick. And that kicking action is due to drag on that bait causing that action, which slows down the rate of fall, either of the bait by itself or when you put it on the back of a jig. But what I noticed is I would cast that jig out there and it would shoot to the bottom, and a lot of times there would be bass suspended around the trees and around the rocks and around the bluffs that I was actually fishing, and it would go past them so fast that they would follow it for a minute and then they just kind of ease off of it and ease back up to where they were sitting, and they didn't really want to chase it. In a lot of instances, that was happening in the super cold water that we're experiencing right now in the late winter and what we'll experience in the early spring as well. And so when I threw the chigger crawl on the back of there, and it slowed down the rate of fall on this jig just a little bit, and that thing passed by those fish just in a little bit slower of a manner, they would keep following it, follow it all the way to the bottom. And as soon as that thing hit the bottom, they would eat it and they would have it. And that's just something that I noticed, and it's kind of counterintuitive to what even I've talked about on this channel before, is normally with bass in the late winter and colder water temperatures, you want a straight tail trailer, something that doesn't have any kick or any action on its own. You want something that's just going to kind of sit there. But I think this jig, being as small as it is, but with that really heavy weight on the top, dropping as fast as it does, having something that slows it down just a little bit is going to entice some of those late winter, really lethargic bass that oftentimes just want to follow things and not eat them, to actually follow that thing down there and to eat it. And so I think that the rate of fall as well as the kick on that bait makes those fish actually follow it and want to eat it. Next thing that little trailer does is it's just an awesome trailer. That thing's going to stand up, those little claws in that defensive position. They're going to have just a little bit of kick even when you're dragging it on the bottom. And that's what I love about that max scent trigger crawl in particular. This thing performs really, really well even in super cold water. It's not a big dramatic kick when you're doing like the little technique that we're going to talk about here in just a minute, actually tip 3 on actually how I fish this thing. But what it is, it's just little subtle kicks, and it'll flare up. You can kind of give it a little bit and then just little subtle kicks. And those little subtle movements, if they don't want to follow it down and eat it on the fall, that'll entice those fish, those lethargic fish, to just swim over and suck this thing in and to eat it, because that's what we're doing. We're really tricking fish with this jig in a lot of instances. We're making it look like a really small crawdad, or if you're up north, a goby, or some sort of little rock darter or snell darter or log perch or something really small that's kind of just shooting around on the bottom. And a lot of times those fish want to take advantage of those things in the winter because, again, they're lethargic and they don't really want to eat. The next tip is going to be make it more compact. So even though I'm fishing that 3-inch chigger crawl on the back, I am still actually cutting this bait down. So if you guys can see on this jig, and we'll see if we can get it to show up for you guys, I'm actually cutting off that first little body segment of that chigger crawl. So we'll pull one out of the package here and I'll actually show you guys. So there's a little 3-inch chigger crawl. This is the smallest chigger crawl that they make. And as you guys can see, this thing is broken into 3 or 4 segments right here. And so I actually cut off that top segment right there, that those legs are, where the legs start, I'm actually cutting off right above that, and I'm actually taking that top part on there, off of there. And the reason that I do that is just to make this thing even more compact than it already is. And I think that that's another big key to this jig, is just how small it actually is. Like I said, oftentimes I'm going to be fishing this thing in areas where normally I would fish a Ned rig, but I can actually pick up this half-ounce jig, use that casting gear, and be able to get that same small finesse profile, but have just a little bit of the bulk of that jig in there, that silicone or living rubber skirt that helps to entice those even bigger fish to eat as well. And so make it compact. And most of these jigs are going to come straight out of the package with quite a bit of skirt material on them. I've actually trimmed this jig up already, but could actually use a little bit more of a trimming. And so normally what I do to trim a jig is I'll pull all of that skirt material down, and I will run my fingers down and pinch it in between my fingers like that at the bottom of the curve of that hook, and then just trim that off with some scissors. And that's going to help not only to kind of lighten that jig up a little bit, give it a little bit less bulk, but when that living rubber or that silicone, as you guys can see, has a little bit less tension on it from just being pulled down by the weight of itself and the length of itself, that will actually kind of pop that jig out. And I think that that's something else that works really, really well, is when this thing actually lays on the bottom, you guys can see all of those little bitty strands of jig material are sticking up, and they're going to do the same thing in the water. They're going to float up, and they're just going to have ever so slight movements. And again, when you're dealing with really lethargic bass, oftentimes we got to trick them, and I think sometimes having something like that, something that's just got those slight little movements, just like a crawdad or some little bait fish would have, that's going to entice those fish to bite even more. Now, the last tip that I want to give you guys is probably the most important tip that I have for actually fishing this little bitty compact finesse jig, and it's actually how I fish this jig. And it's the kind of the technique or the retrieve that I use to fish this jig, and I think it's something that makes it super duper effective. And this is actually something that I kind of retrofitted, we'll say, or applied from something that Mark Zona talks about. So Mark Zona does what he calls cracking a tube. And if you ever watch Mark Zona crack a tube, it's really, really interesting. What he does is he'll be fishing that tube, and he'll get it like hung up in some grass, or like kind of get it over a rock, or even some instances just out in the open, and he'll start kind of hitting the slack of his line, and then he'll kind of pop that tube. And what I've noticed is when you hit the slack on this jig, it does kind of the same thing that a tube does, or any other bait that you would do that kind of same technique with. So I call it just hitting my slack or hopping my slack in my line. And so what I do is I actually cast that jig out there, and with quite a bit of slack on my line, almost like I'm fishing a jerkbait, I kind of just pop the slack in my line, and then I'll kind of get it tightened up, and then I'll hop it over whatever it's hung on. Right there. Yep. Oh, there's one with him too. Holy. Yep. That's a freaking good one. And I'll kind of just continue that technique until I fished it all the way back to the boat. And this is really effective when I'm fishing it around trees, rocks, grass, anything that I can kind of get that jig kind of hung behind, and I just sit there and kind of crack that slack. And what I noticed is I actually went up really shallow one day in some clear water, and I was like, I want to see what exactly that's doing to that jig, because I kind of discovered that method of fishing it by accident while also kind of applying what Zona was talking about. I actually got it hung up one day behind a rock, and I was kind of just sitting there hitting the slack, actually trying to get it unhung, and I hit it, and then I finally popped it hard enough, and it popped up over that rock, and when it did, pop, I got a bite, and it was a really, really big bite. And so then I started just kind of repeating that to see, was that just a total coincidence, or was that actually a pattern? And it ended up being the pattern, and it's a pattern that I've been able to run with on multiple different lakes, different parts of the country, different bodies of water, water style and everything, different kinds of cover and everything, and it's been something that has just been super effective for me. And so again, I kind of just sit there and I kind of pop that slack in that line just like I would with a jerk bait until I kind of get it run up on whatever it is, reel down, and then give it a good hard crack to pop it up over that cover. Now this is something that you can do in open water as well, and it's something that I actually do in open water, especially when we get into late winter, early spring, where we start to see these bass move up on big flats, is I'll use this bait to cover water on a flat and get a ton of bites doing that. So whether it's a big gravel flat, a big sand flat with rocks all throughout it, I'll kind of just do that same thing. Even if I'm not hung up behind anything, just kind of hit that slack making those kind of almost, I think, and what I saw with this when I got up shallow and was kind of talking to you guys about it, is it just made these like little bitty micro movements. It wasn't really moving forward a lot. It was just like this little bitty kind of micro pulse, and all of a sudden it just, and it would like jump up and then hit the bottom. And I think it looks like a crawdad or a goby or a rock perch or a log perch. If you watch a lot of those things, they kind of make these little like micro movements, and then all of a sudden they're like, okay, now I got to really move, and they're like, woo, and then they go. And crawdads do the same thing. All those little bitty bait fish do the same thing, and that's exactly what this jig was doing. I would just pop that slack, and even just here, if I hold this line up here and I just kind of pop that slack, you guys can see it's just like a little bitty micro movement, and then really pop it and it wants to move. And that's exactly what I'm doing. And when you're on about a 30 or 40 or 60 foot cast and you're just popping that slack, that thing's going to have a ton of that movement like that, and then you pop it hard and it's going to move it. And I think oftentimes those bass are sitting there and they're watching that thing, and it's kind of moving, and then when it pops, you actually get that reaction by it. So you're tricking them by getting them to look at it. They're looking at it going, is that real? Is it not? Their little brains, they don't think like we do, but their little brains are processing. Instincts are kicking in, and they're going, is that real? Is it not? Is it real? Is it not? And then when that thing pops away from them really fast, they can't help but react to it and to eat it. And really, to me, that's the most important thing when fishing this finesse jig, is to do that hop the slack or crack the slack or whatever you want to call it kind of technique to get these bass to eat this little bitty finesse jig. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you guys about is the rod, reel, and line setup that I'm actually throwing this jig on. Now, this is really important as well, and I think when it comes to kind of the reel, it's not as important, but definitely the line and the rod. So the line that I'm actually fishing this jig on is 12-pound fluorocarbon. So that's some really light fluorocarbon. A lot of times that's the kind of fluorocarbon that we're going to use for jerk baits and crankbaits and really light finesse applications. And so I started out by throwing 15. And with the 15, I just didn't feel like I had as much feel as I did with that little bit lighter line. And it also didn't have as much bounce in it as I wanted to kind of get that slack hopping that I was talking about just a minute ago. And so I ended up dropping down to some 12-pound straight fluorocarbon, and I was able to get that little bit of a bend that I was actually looking for in that line, and just have a little bit more contact and feel with that jig. Now, when you do drop down to line that is that light, you got to be careful with the rod and reel, or the rod in particular, not really the reel sort of, but the rod that you're actually choosing. And so this is a new rod, but it is a rod that is built after another rod that I was using and really, really like. This is the brand new Abu Garcia Veritas, the 7.6 medium heavy fast. Now, the thing about this medium heavy fast, and this is kind of, again, modeled after another Abu Garcia rod, the Fanatista X. Those two rods really, when you get into that medium heavy range, aren't truly a medium heavy. I would call them kind of a more medium with a little bit of medium heavy in them. And I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about here, see if we can get backed up enough to show you. But you guys can see this rod has a ton of parabolic bend. I'm going to back up here even more. This rod has a ton of parabolic bend in it, and it's actually bending down all the way to the third or fourth guide from the bottom. And so this thing really is more of like a medium heavy to medium fast, or a medium heavy kind of moderate fast. And that's really what I'm looking for with this jig. And the reason that I'm looking for that is simply because these jigs don't have giant hooks in them. These aren't big hooks. These are finesse hooks. These are light wire hooks. The one in the Contact being that little 1/0, the one in that Bass Union being a little 2/0. These are little bitty hooks that can bend out. And that's one thing that I was really worried about when throwing this thing on casting gear, was bending these hooks out. But after I experimented with a bunch of rods and really kind of got it dialed in with the little bit lighter line, and this rod in particular, I was able to dial in a setup that I felt comfortable casting this 1/2 ounce jig on, because that's the thing, it is 1/2 ounce, and when you put that trailer on there, I mean, you've got quite a bit of bulk to actually cast this thing. But then I've got that little bit more of a parabolic bend in that rod, that little bit slower action that I was looking for, as well as having that sensitivity that I need with that line and that rod combination to be able to feel this jig on the bottom and to be able to get bites. And then the reel that I got it paired up with is a more kind of finesse style reel that does a really good job of handling casting super light line, and that's a Xenon MGX. Now this is a very, very premium price reel, but it is a shallower spool and it's designed to throw lighter baits or lighter line with, and so that's why I actually paired it up with this rod. I mean, you're looking at a $100 rod with about a $300 reel on it, and you know, oftentimes that's kind of my philosophy behind rods and reels, is buy the more premium reel, because the reel is definitely going to be a way more durable product than your rod is. Oftentimes you're not going to break your reel, but you can step on your rod, slam it in the truck door, slam it in the tailgate, your buddy can step on it. I mean, so many things can happen with the rod versus the reel breaking. And so I, you know, oftentimes go with a little bit more premium reel on these more affordable rods, and tend to make really, really good setups that help to catch fish. But yeah, guys, that's my tips on fishing this little bitty finesse jig for winter bass. This is something I would definitely suggest you guys go check out. I think that you guys will be able to go catch some fish on it. And if you want to watch some more tips on winter jig fishing, click this video that's popping up right here.